Okay, it's 2 o'clock and welcome everybody to the breakout session on funding. I'm delighted to have Robert Mansolillo from Matrix Design Group and Adam Cray talking about funding mechanisms and the different types of funding mechanisms. And their bios, I'm going to put them in the chat, are at the link that I just put on the chat. Thank you, Adam, and thank you, Robert. Please go ahead and get started.
Sure, great. Well, thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here. Why don't I just take 1 second here and share my screen so everyone can see this presentation. Okay. No technical difficulties here.
Oh, let me make sure that you have the permission, that you've been granted permission. So I'll just message my team members to make sure that you can share your screen. It could be that thing. So just 1 second. I thought we had disabled that, but let me know and let me see if I can allow that. Or no, I don't see where. Let's see if you can be assigned as a co-host, Adam, and see if we can do that.
Is everyone able to see the presentation? I just tried to put it up and it looks like it's sharing.
Oh, there it is.
Okay, great.
I think, can everybody see it?
Yeah,
Yes, I can see it.
All right.
Okay, well done. Thank you.
Excellent. All right. Well, welcome everyone. We are here to talk about affordable housing financing tools for local governments in Arizona. And I am joined here. My name is Adam Cray. I'm with CSG Advisors, and I'm joined with Robert from Matrix Design Group. We're working closely with Matrix on the financing piece of this presentation. So just a little bit of background on sort of what we'll be talking about today. I have a little overview for you. Briefly, we'll go through CSG and do a little introduction, given that we haven't spoken to you all very much so far today, and discuss our housing finance experience a little bit. Then we're gonna cast a very wide net. So we'll talk through all things affordable housing finance for local governments, everything from single family programs to multifamily programs that local governments can create. So it's the name of the game here is breadth rather than depth. We're trying to identify all these concepts, give you a little bit of background, and at the end of the day, have you coming away with questions and being interested in pursuing some of these topics further. So on the single family side, we'll talk through first mortgage loan programs, down payment assistance, rehabilitation and retrofitting assistance, and mortgage credit certificate programs, all of which are major features of single family in the single family world. And then on the multifamily side, we'll walk through sort of an initial overview that kind of frames multifamily finance as fundamentally about gap financing, and then showing you 9 different ways to provide to close those gaps in deals. And then finally, I have an appendix for you on opportunities under the Inflation Reduction Act, specifically the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, because we talk about it a few times in both the single family and multifamily sections, and it's a really important opportunity right now. We have a moment to access a very large amount of funding under the IRA for green lending and investment programs. So we'll let you peruse that appendix later on. So initially, the overview here, as I mentioned, our role, we're just working with Matrix to provide additional subject matter expertise on affordable housing finance. CSG, we were founded in 1978 as the first financial advisory firm in the nation dedicated to serving the nation's housing finance agencies. Our footprint is pretty wide across the country. We have offices in Atlanta, Los Angeles, New York, and San Francisco, and we serve agencies all over the U.S. In terms of ownership, our firm is 100% employee owned, majority women owned, and 30% of shares are held by minorities. And we have, over the years, worked for more than half of all state housing finance agencies and half of the 50 largest cities, including Phoenix. A good amount of experience in Arizona, which we'll talk about in a second. In terms of specifically our affordable housing and finance experience, so you get an idea, we are sort of by far the largest municipal housing advisor in the nation. So we've done, in terms of volume, we've between 2002 and 2022, we advised on 29% more issues than any other advisor. We also focus pretty heavily not just on bond issuance, but on program development, the sorts of programs that you all may be interested in creating after sitting through this presentation. And we've worked with over 150 public agencies and nonprofits to create programs and program-related things like manuals and training programs. In terms of additional experience that's relevant here, we have worked with over 40 housing authorities across the country on major real estate developments, and we've helped them also develop lots of programs to deploy subsidy. And it's one of the things that excuse me, I'll talk about later on, is sort of the importance of utilizing operating subsidy from those PHA partners. And then finally, as I mentioned before, just our experience in Arizona, CSG, we served as financial advisor to local governments in Arizona since 1987, including Phoenix Housing Department and the IDAs of Phoenix and Maricopa County. So on the single family side, just providing a broad overview, and setting the table here, when we say single family, we mean home ownership. So, that can include everything from a standalone single family home to units in multifamily dwellings like condos. Really the thing that ties single family finance together is just the ownership component and how you finance that. Single family programs generally serve higher AMI individuals, just given the economics in most markets of what low income individuals can afford in terms of rent versus a mortgage payment. These are programs that often serve folks over 80% of AMI, which is important depending on what your mission and who you would like to serve in your programs. So here, just a little quick overview, as I mentioned before, of the types of single-family programs operated by local governments, and the things that we're going to talk about here: first mortgage programs, down payment assistance programs, rehab programs, and mortgage credit certificate programs. So on the first mortgage side, the type of assistance here is what you would typically expect to get from your mortgage bank, from the bank that you typically work with on all your financial needs. Local governments can provide that service as well, and in many cases, the difference in the rate between what you'll get at the bank and what your local government can provide under some circumstances is significantly lower. That is to say, the local government can give you about an 80 basis point discount depending on the type of financing you use. So to that point, it really depends on how the programs are funded. So there are a couple of ways first mortgage loan programs are funded by local governments. And really the two main ways are through the TBA market and through mortgage revenue bond programs. Only one of those solutions gets you deep discounts below the market. And that's the MRB program. And that's only if you're able to issue tax-exempt bonds. And there are some caveats around that and some things to think about in terms of your ability to do that. The TBA market, though, it's not producing loans that are out of the market. You could run a local first mortgage program that was pretty consistent with the rates of local banks and provide some other assistance like down payment assistance, which we'll talk about in a minute. Alongside those loans, plenty of of local governments do that. A good example I can think of is DC right now, who runs a TBA program and does not access tax exempt volume cap for its mortgage program. So I want to stop here just for a second and just talk a little bit about volume cap. It's probably a concept that folks haven't heard too much about in the past. And so really you can kind of think of a volume cap as the maximum amount of private activity bonds that a state can issue in any given year. And that's really speaks to the state's ability to issue debt that is federally tax exempt. And so this is a way that the federal government, rations that scarce resource. They don't want too many tax exempt bonds out there because it would significantly reduce the amount of tax liability that among all these entities and reduce the amount of taxes that the federal government receives. So there's a cap. In Arizona, you all get about $900 million a year of volume cap. And the Arizona Finance Authority is who allocates that to individual issuers who run these kinds of programs. So in terms of how local governments can participate in a program like this, I'll say, virtually any government can create a first mortgage program and provide pretty competitive rates, like I said before, but you're not going to get the real deep discounts unless you are one of these sort of big four IDAs in Arizona. This is Maricopa County, Pima County, Phoenix, and Tucson, because under state law, only those programs can access volume cap for single-family purposes. Down payment assistance, that's that second, sort of important program that I talked about. And this is really what helps folks purchase homes who couldn't otherwise afford them. This is, a lot of times people cannot get together a 20% down payment or so, that liquidity necessary to close on a mortgage loan is really what keeps them from buying. And so these kinds of programs provide subordinate loans at 0% interest for a large portion of the down payment to help people get there. The way these programs are funded, they can be funded through a TBA program or a mortgage revenue bond program like we talked about on the first mortgage side. Typically, as we'll talk about in a second with Phoenix and Maricopa, you run a program that provides both first mortgages and DPA assistance to help lower income buyers. Some federal sources for DPA include CDBG, hardest hit fund grants. The hardest hit fund is a source for the state's DPA program in Arizona that goes up to 10%. And CDBG is used heavily by our client in Puerto Rico, particularly disaster relief funds under CDBG to fund very, very generous down payment assistance loans for low-income buyers on the island. And then finally, this is a source that every local government has access to, and it really takes that political will to get there. And so it's local trust funds that are capitalized using these public finance tools that I've noted here. So it's things like general obligation bond measures, sales tax measures, transient occupancy tax, things of that nature. All of those types of programs we've seen across the country. All those types of tools we've seen used across the country to raise funds to support affordable housing. For example, our client in Alameda County, California, we helped them several years ago issue $600 million of general obligation bonds, and they used that to fund both single-family and multifamily programs. So, those public finance tools and creating trust funds for these purposes, really a sure way to get there, so long as, of course, as I mentioned, you have the political will to do that. If voters are not going to vote for these sorts of things, then you're not going to get anywhere. In terms of the opportunities to participate, again, virtually any local government can create a DPA program and fund it with the sources I just mentioned. But the cheapest funding is going to come from those tax exempt bonds that I talked about with in the piece about first mortgages, and of course, access to that volume cap that's going to allow you to get that tax exempt rate is limited to those four entities I mentioned. So the third type of program that I want to talk about is rehabilitation and retrofitting programs. And these really, these are programs for existing homeowners that, may need some help fixing up their homes or retrofitting their homes and making them more efficient. We at CSG, I shouldn't say we, because I certainly was not here back in 1978, but at that time, the founder of our firm helped create Pittsburgh's rehabilitation loan program that fixed up probably half of the homes in the city of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. We created a similar program for Alameda County, and we should note that Maricopa County also has a rehab program that it funds. How these programs are funded is really the key here. They can be funded with the same kinds of sources I talked about before, MRB issuances and federal sources like CDBG, and of course those public finance sources that I mentioned that require some political will to get done. But importantly here, particularly with respect to green lending and investment, we are in a moment of opportunity to fund those programs. There are, because of, as I mentioned before, the Inflation Reduction Act, there are billions of dollars available right now under its greenhouse gas reduction fund programs to finance lending and investment programs for all types of retrofitting, new construction, and any number of initiatives that will reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And so it's green lending programs is how they're typically framed. And you can see in the appendix all of the details on the 3 greenhouse gas reduction fund programs, and we'll talk a little bit about them in this. Give you a little bit more of an overview in a second, but this is the time to access those funds. So as I said, as with first mortgage and DPA programs, most local governments can create these kinds of programs, but state law limits the ability to finance these programs on a tax exempt basis. So really, the greenhouse gas reduction fund programs are your best bet. $27 billion under the GGRF alone to help finance at least green retrofitting of single family, and of course, as we'll talk about later, multifamily. So here is just a brief overview of the rehab and retrofitting assistance that's available under the GGRF. So there are 3 programs of note: Solar for All, National Clean Investment Fund, and the Clean Communities Investment Accelerator. I provide more details on all of them and eligibility and all those sorts of things in the appendix, but the thing to note is that there are a lot of funds available. They have been granted to nonprofit entities across the country who will then, in very short order, be subgranting and lending at below market rates to local governments and other nonprofits to create programs for these end uses that I've noted here. So under Solar for All, it's expanding access to solar photovoltaic technology in low-income communities. The National Clean Investment Fund, the largest pot of money here, is really the, as you'll see later, the possibilities are nearly endless because the mandate is incredibly broad with what kind of products can be created and what kind of projects can be funded. And then finally, the Clean Communities Investment Accelerator, particularly for local governments, small lenders that don't have a lot of green lending experience. This is a program that it would be great for you because it is about capacity building. And so there's some seed funding available under that program, and there's also some technical assistance funding that's available to help you build that green lending capacity. Finally, we'll talk a little bit about mortgage credit certificates on the single family side. I don't want to spend too much time here because, as you're going to see, the MCC statute limits the use of these tools to the big four IDAs that I mentioned before. So this is really a kind of a primer on the program, so that when you hear it mentioned, you know what a mortgage credit certificate is, you know how it operates, and I have an example here of a calculation of a typical MCC. So that is single family finance, and I actually want to stop here and before we move on to multifamily, because we've covered a lot of ground, I want to check and see if folks have any questions.
I'm not seeing anything in the chat right now.
All right. Hearing none, we'll move on to multifamily. And so this is one of my favorite topics. I started my career at S&P rating housing bonds, and that group works with both single family and multifamily programs. But several years of my career after S&P were on the multifamily side, running a bond program for San Francisco, and then working at B of A doing tax credit equity investment and LIHTC investment, tax credit equity investment and construction lending, I should say. So multifamily is near and dear to me. Now that I'm at CSG, I'm back in the single family world as well, but have been doing multifamily work for over a decade. So really, in the context of affordable housing finance, the term multifamily refers to rental housing as opposed to for-sale housing. It's, when you hear multifamily, you should think rental. Again, it's possible to have a multifamily building that has single family financing in it, right? I mean, it could be a condo. And so really, when you think multifamily financing program, think rental housing. These programs tend to serve lower income individuals as compared to the single family programs, as I mentioned. So this is typically folks under 80% of AMI. The reasons for that we discussed before. There are some additional reasons around what 4% tax credits, 9% tax credits will allow in terms of maximum affordability. And being that LIHTC is the primary method of financing affordable multifamily housing, the income limits that come out of the LIHTC program are particularly important. So really, if you take nothing from this slide, other than this, I think you'll be in good shape. Multifamily finance really is, as I mentioned before, about filling the gap. That's the way that you have to think about all multifamily finance programs that you might create. Essentially, there is a gap that's created when you suppress rent levels below market rents for the benefit of affordability for low-income people, right? So there is some amount of debt and equity that is supportable by market rate rents, and when you lower those rents artificially and set them at a lower level, that creates a gap in the financing. There is less income on an annual basis to support debt and to support equity returns for someone. And so there is a gap, and we need to figure out how to fill it. And so there are common tools that local governments use, and there are probably dozens more that I'm not talking about here. But we've got 27 slides, and I think any one of these topics I could spend 45 minutes and 27 slides talking about. So as I said before, it's a broad overview, and I tried to focus on the programs that are both most common and really top of mind right now. So, with that in mind, the most common by far financing mechanism, as I mentioned before, is private activity bonds and 4% LIHTC. IDAs across the state are able to create often conduit issuance programs, that is programs that with no recourse to the local government's finances. So you're a conduit bond issuer where the only security for the bonds is the project itself and not the local government's coffers. You're able to create a conduit issuance program, issue private activity bonds, get that volume cap that we talked about before to issue these PABs, and get 4% LIHTC. That's really the most important piece of this. Yes, the private activity bonds, because of their tax exemption, will often lead to lower cost permanent financing on a deal, but that's not the real benefit of PAB for multifamily. The real benefit is that it allows you to generate 4% LIHTC equity, which, despite the fact that it's called 4%, actually covers 30% of the cost of developing the project in general. There are reasons behind the 4% moniker that I won't get into, but 4% means 30% of the project cost in this case. And that is, as I mentioned before, for projects that meet federal requirements for affordability. And so the set-asides that are applicable for 4% deals and 9% deals for that matter are 20%. You have to either have 20% of the units in the project at 50% of AMI, 40% of those units at 60% of AMI. So, as I'll mention in a second, it gets a little more complicated with 9% deals because in many places, well, everywhere, 9% is a scarce resource. And so often the qualified allocation plans that states put forward to allocate that resource require much deeper affordability than these minimums. So how are these funded? As I mentioned, IDAs are able to issue these bonds. It's not just the big four, as with single family programs. IDAs across the state are able to issue by applying to the Arizona Finance Authority for volume cap to issue the bonds, and having the sponsors apply to the Department of Housing for an allocation of 4% credits. And so this is a sort of partnership between the issuer, which is often a local government, and the private developer. So really the opportunities here are much greater for participation from local governments across the state for that reason. Just a little bit of a schematic here on 4% LIHTC, and frankly, this also applies to 9% LIHTC structures as well. So this is a great great visualization of how this typically works. Here you've got the federal government allocating credits, like I said, every year. On the private activity bond side, it's $900 million for PAB volume cap. There's a similar cap related to credits, 4% and 9% credits. And so state housing agencies receive that money, and then they're able to make awards to developers. There's a process here. Essentially, this is just a process of investing in those tax credits. So just because you have a tax credit doesn't mean you have money in a deal. Somebody has to have tax liability to make use of a tax credit. And so there's often a syndicator involved. Sometimes there's a direct investor. But at any rate, someone who has tax liability buys your tax credits and ends up owning 99.9% of your project, so that they can reap those tax benefits. And as a result, you're able to get 30 or 70% of the cost of producing your project covered by either 4% or 9% LIHTC. On the 9% side, this is a much deeper subsidy. As I mentioned, it covers 70% of the cost of developing a project. The income set-asides, though, are exactly the same as the 4%. But like I said, because it's a scarcer resource and it provides a much deeper subsidy, often states, QAPs they favor projects with deeper affordability that provide greater public benefits. This is funded in the same way that 4% LIHTC is. There's an application to to the Department of Housing for 9% allocations as well. The difference here is that you don't need private activity bonds to access 9% LIHTC. So, the opportunity for local government interaction here often is in the form of something we're going to talk about in a second, gap loans and grants. So just here, a quick comparison of 4% and 9% LIHTC. As I mentioned, much deeper subsidy on the 9% side, typically not able to be used with other federal subsidies, again, because it's much deeper. Often the allocation is not competitive for 4%. That's what everyone says, but there are plenty of people in a dozen or so states across the country that will say different. In California, for example, LIHTC, 4% LIHTC is typically oversubscribed, and so there is a competitive process to allocate that there as well. And so often, for example, you would not get away with 20 units at 50% of AMI in California or many other states because it is a scarce resource that has to be allocated as such. And then the other thing I mentioned, again, no requirement to issue private activity bonds to access those 9% LIHTC credits. Next thing I want to talk about here is state credits. So this is a type of assistance very similar to the federal LIHTC that the state rolled out in 2021. These are available for projects receiving 4% and 9% allocations, and they provide a subsidy at least the same as, at least 50% of what the federal LIHTC will provide for these projects. The key to note is, of course, this is a state tax credit, and so you have to have Arizona tax liability to make use of it in the same way that you have to have federal tax liability as an investor to make use of the federal LIHTC. And so what that means is often state credits are going to price lower in any state than federal credits because you just have a smaller pool of investors who are who have the demand for those kinds of instruments because they have state, lots of state tax liability. Like I said, really one of the most common ways local governments assist affordable multifamily projects is through gap loans and grants. Most often, these gap loans are provided with some kind of a below market interest rate. It's often around 3%. It's typically around the applicable federal rate. And they're payable from residual receipts, which means that it's not a hard debt payment like a first mortgage, a senior mortgage. It's deeply subordinate, and only after the cash flows through all of through the expenses and through all of the other debt sources do you get some portion of that cash flow to pay off your loan. But at the end of the day, it's still better than a grant, which you never see again. These programs are typically funded, in a similar way to subsidy on the single family side. It's things like CDBG and home, local trust funds with public finance tools and that sort of thing. Next thing I want to talk about is operating subsidies. And so really when you see operating subsidy, 9 times out of 10, what folks are going to be talking about is Section 8. It's public housing authorities having set project-based, most often Section 8 authority to put in a project that is deeply affordable. So we're talking, housing for extremely low income households at 30% of AMI or less, transition age youth, formerly homeless people, and folks who really need permanent supportive housing. And so when you have that little rent coming from the tenant side to support the project, you often need ongoing operating subsidy to make the deal pencil in the long term. And so that's what Section 8 is really, really great for. And the opportunities here for local governments really revolve around partnerships with PHAs. And so, getting involved with your local PHA and having a dialogue, telling them the kinds of projects that you're interested in doing and that you're supporting with gap lending, perhaps with bond issuance, and working to align their resources in the form of vouchers with your projects is an excellent idea. We work with agencies across the country to do that. Currently, we're working with the Boise City-Ada County Housing Authority on the public housing side to partner with the city on projects that the city wants to do, particularly in the permanent supportive housing realm, because they wouldn't otherwise be feasible without deep ongoing subsidy. Public land programs. So this really is what it sounds like. Local governments often have some surplus land that they're not using. It's things like former school sites or parking lots or maintenance yards. Property that the government owns that it could probably part with for the right reasons. And so a lot of times what local governments will do is say, okay, we have this public land. That's an important resource. Land's expensive. It drives up the cost of affordable housing production. We will contribute that land to a developer who is willing to create affordable housing. That is to say, housing, with X number of units limited at X percentage of area median income. Often, the way these programs work is that public land will be ground leased to the development, and the city will own the land for perpetuity. What it doesn't own typically is the improvements, particularly in the case of LIHTC deals where you've got to have the LIHTC partnership owning the improvements so that you can get your tax credit, your tax credit equity. And so, you're only owning the ground, but what that allows you to do as a government is ensure affordability forever, essentially. You've got a ground lease in place, you've got a LURA in place, you've got, these requirements for affordability levels, and to the extent that a developer doesn't comply, you're able to step in and require them to, essentially. Next thing I want to talk about is tax abatement programs. And so, there are lots of ways to do this. In Arizona, you're fortunate to have kind of an automatic exemption for affordable housing projects. And typically that's defined as projects that would qualify under those set-asides for federal LIHTC, 20 at 50, 40 at 60, that sort of thing. And so for those kind of projects, they're already tax exempt. But the kind of projects that aren't is what we would typically consider workforce or middle income housing. And so these are projects with maybe 20% of units at 80%, below 80% of AMI, and another 10% below 50. So not qualifying for the federal LIHTC set-asides, but otherwise worthy projects from a public policy perspective. Workforce housing and middle income housing are hot buttons right now, and they're things that local governments are constantly pressured to assist with. And so a lot of our clients are doing that across the country. We're working with Atlanta right now, which has a lot of surplus land across the city, and it has transferred a lot of it to an entity that's a part of the housing authority. And part of the business model there is going to be to deploy that surplus public land along with some tax abatements and things of that nature in service of developing affordable housing that is not otherwise eligible for LIHTC financing. In Arizona, there is a specific type of program called I'm not even going to try to pronounce what the acronym would be, but it's Government Property Lease Excise Tax. And so essentially GPLET. And so what that essentially does is a private developer sells or I should say, transfers the land to the local government, which then the government owns both the land and the improvements, as distinct from the model I talked about earlier, where the government's only owning the land. Here we're owning the land and the improvements, and in exchange, you're automatically exempt from tax because it's a government-owned property. And instead of levying that property tax, there's an excise tax that is levied, which is much lower than what would otherwise be paid in property tax. And so it's another way that you can help close that financing gap by reducing the amount of payments that are made from a project on an annual basis. Last couple of program types I'm going to talk about here. Transit-oriented financing programs. So these things are really for projects that are situated near and often planned around transportation infrastructure. We're talking things like subways and light rail and bus terminals, often referred to as TOD. And really the most exciting of these programs the most exciting sources to fund these types of projects out there today are RIF and TIFIA, which are run by the Department of Transportation. And not to get too far into it, I could talk about eligibility and all these sorts of things, but just to give you an idea, both of these programs provide long-term financing on extremely beneficial terms. So, for example, today the rate on a 35-year maturity loan would be 4.18%. So anyone who's been involved in multifamily deals lately knows that that's several hundred basis points below what you could get in the market today on a loan of that tenor. So obviously that reduces, that increases the amount of debt you're able to leverage on a deal in the long term and reduces the gap. These loans and loan guarantees also have amortization of up to 35 years, some 75 years, depending on some special requirements. 5-year repayment deferral, no prepayment penalties, all sorts of really beneficial terms come out of both RIF and TIFIA. And so really the opportunity for local governments is to work with developers to help them access these funds. And it's not the easiest thing. For example, under TIFIA, you've got to have an investment grade rating on your project in order to get a TIFIA loan. Well, as a former rating analyst, I'll tell you that that's not an easy thing to do just on the basis of project revenues. Unenhanced multifamily ratings in an investment grade level are very expensive in terms of the amount of, for example, debt service coverage you're going to be required to have over 100, 150 and things of that nature. It's going to really drop the size of your potential loan. Another way you could get to an investment grade rating as well, you could have a bank letter of credit or something like that. But again, that costs money. So, often LOCs are going to be, 100 basis points a year. So really there's opportunity for local governments to step in on those kind of projects and say, all right, we will provide a portion of the credit enhancement that will allow you to get to an investment grade rating on this project, which will in turn allow you to access these incredibly low interest rates. And so this is something we're working on in Atlanta with our client there, and a very large transit-oriented development near a MARTA station, which is their subway system, that is looking right now to get TIFIA financing, but obviously is trying to figure out how to get to that investment grade rating. And so there are lots of opportunities for local governments to assist with that process. And then finally, the last set of programs I want to talk about is just these green lending investment programs I had mentioned earlier. So, like I said, Solar for All and the National Clean Investment Fund and the Clean Communities Investment Accelerator are on the cusp of giving us $27 billion of green financing over the next couple of years. It's a lot of money that will be available for local governments to access. Most of this funding is going to be available to support green lending and investment for both single family and multifamily projects, especially in low income and disadvantaged communities. And so, I'm highlighting here on the right-hand side kind of key upcoming dates. And really, we're in August right now. The EPA is working with all those grantees who receive these giant grants, which you can read about in the appendix, to finalize their grant programs. They'll be getting funds fairly soon, and many of those term sheets are going to be issued later this year for the programs that these nonprofits are going to stand up to lend to, folks like local governments and local nonprofits and lenders, community lenders. And so, the deadline to disperse all these funds is October of this year. This money will be out the door. It will be with the recipients, and they will start making loans sometime in the fourth quarter of this year or early next year, if all things go well. And so, like I said, now really is the time for local governments to start thinking about creating these programs to take advantage of these funding sources. If green lending and investment is something that is, in your, if it's something that you, as a matter of policy, are looking to promote in your jurisdictions. And so here, like I said, I've got the appendix for you. You can run through this later on. It just gives you the types of activities and the types of products that you could create under, Solar for All, NCIF, and the Clean Communities Investment Accelerator. And that's all I have in terms of a presentation. I think we have a good amount of time for some question and answer.
Thank you so much, Adam, for this comprehensive overview. It was really, really interesting. And we're opening up the floor for questions. Anyone have questions? Well, I have one while people think of a question. It's a very basic question, Adam. If we take several steps back and you are, let's say, this is for a smaller community, 35, 45,000, maybe 50, and they have an empty lot, for example, like you mentioned, or an empty maintenance yard, and they're interested in talking to developers for profit or nonprofit and partnering with communities. Do they need to think of the funding mechanism, or are nonprofits who are working in the affordable housing or housing world? Let's not use a technical term of affordable housing. We're talking about housing in general, whether it's market rate or not. Does that community seek out partners, or are there nonprofit or for-profit or emerging developers who look at market rate or below market rate attainable housing, building the units? Do they approach cities? Are they always on the lookout for what can be done? Or do cities need to package things and kind of proactively look at partnering with organizations or funding or all of the above? What's the first step somebody would take if let's say you're a city of 50,000 people and you have an empty lot that potentially could be developed into housing that is attainable in terms of funding?
Sure. Yeah, so, depending on the community, developers are on the lookout. And they do approach local governments all the time with opportunities to develop housing projects in their jurisdictions. But that's not the position you want to be in as a local government. And we work with lots of agencies that are faced with this all the time. They're constantly bombarded. Boise is a good example. They've had a lot of proposals of late of folks saying, we would love to partner with you on XYZ initiative. And so we're having to step in and look at the financials of projects and proposals and figure out what these developers are trying to do in the community, and whether it meets a cost benefit test for our client, and what kinds of safeguards we're going to have to put around the deal to make it safe from a risk perspective for our client. And so the position you really want to be in is not responding to these kinds of initiatives. You want to be proactive about taking a look at what your resources are. In this case, it's land, but it can be, there can be lots of other resources, including, some political will to give up a little bit of tax revenue in the form of payment in lieu of taxes or something like that. And take stock of all those tools that you have at your disposal, and then offer a package out to the public and to developers, and often in the form of an RFP. That's really the best way to do it. Is yes, you can reach out to the developer partners that you already have and that you work with as a city, but you want to cast a wide net, and you want to have a very focused RFP that talks about what you're trying to accomplish, identifies what resources you have in terms of land, what might be possible in terms of, for example, under TIFIA, credit enhancing one of those TIFIA loans. And so you do something, you do want to think about what generally you expect the project to look like when it's done, when you've selected a developer and they go through all the motions of getting to a closing and getting to a stabilized project. You need to think about, before you make that RFP, what you want that project to look like, and what sorts of financing mechanisms are going to be in place. You don't have to solve all the problems, because that's what you're getting the developer for. That's what you're, why you're seeking their help to begin with. Otherwise, you would develop it yourself.
Right.
And so yeah, but you do have to do some preliminary work to figure out what the likely highest and best use in terms of affordable housing that site can support, and what kinds of incentives and tools you have at your disposal to help a developer get there, and then tell them up front that this is what we have in our toolbox to help you make this project.
Okay. That's really helpful. Does anybody else have a question? Because I have another follow-up question. Feel free to unmute and ask the question if you'd like. Otherwise, I have another one for Adam. Okay, I'll go ahead. So in your experience, which departments are the ones collaborating at the start of an idea, saying that there's either an empty parcel or there's an area that can be redeveloped? Which city departments start the work of developing an RFP and analyzing, is this something that we're going to RFP out, and what are the different factors that play into it? Which departments come together, and at what point are elected leaders involved?
Yeah, it's going to be the departments that are incentivized and have a mission to create a product of their own, right? It's going to be, in San Francisco, it's the Mayor's Office of Housing and Community Development. In Atlanta, it's AUD or Invest Atlanta. The agencies are different across cities, but it's not going to be an agency whose job it is to simply shepherd the land in the long term, right? And to ensure that it's fully insured and that it has a fence around it. It's not going to be generally public works folks. It's going to be folks, and it could be, but more often than not, it's going to be the folks whose job it is, because the mayor has said to them, for example, we need X number of affordable housing developed by X number of units of affordable housing developed in the next 5 years. They are focused on that goal. And so what they're out there doing is going, what do we have? What kind of arrows do we have in our quiver citywide to get that housing developed? And so that's most often, from my perspective, what I see. That's where the genesis of these kind of projects is. And it's sort of how, if you think about it, it's kind of how it should be, right? It's the folks whose mission it is to develop that end product, in this case, affordable housing. They're out there looking for the tools they need to do that.
Right. And then another question is that, some of the examples you gave, it's pretty large developments. what are some of the funding mechanisms? What is a minimum size for smaller development? And how long does it take to get fund? Who plays the biggest role in getting funding? If it's any type of light tech, then the city has to be involved. Are there examples of developments where it's privately funded? Perhaps, what can the city or town or tribal community do to attract private funding and yet keep the price attainable?
Yeah, so on the question about project size and how much that matters in terms of financing mechanisms, you really just have to think about that in terms of fixed costs. So it's rarely the case that that there is a hard minimum amount of funding that any number of programs impose on projects, right? It's not as if, I mean, I'm sure there's some incredibly low minimum level, but very small projects. Well, let me put it this way: very small projects often get done with tools like bond financing. But what you have to be cognizant of, as I said, is what are the fixed costs, the things that no matter the size of the project are going to be the same. And so sometimes it's the case that fixed costs of bond issuance, for example, are going to make it really, really expensive to use that mechanism to finance a very small project. But there are no hard and fast rules. I've seen plenty of single digit millions projects in the low 5 or 6 million range for affordable housing bonds. It's possible. A lot of times it will get more expensive though on a kind of per unit basis.
Mhm.
And then so I think the second part of your question was really about if you could remind me, was it attracting developers to work on smaller projects?
Yeah, perhaps that's trying to think exactly what I was asking. What size do projects have to be? Like, what can communities do to attract, if the size is too small to get light tech or other set asides, what are some of the tools that are at their disposal to attract, developers, who then have their own financing and to ensure that a portion of the development, covers people with, anywhere from 30 to 80% of the average median income in the region.
Yeah, so I think a lot of these programs are still relevant for very small projects. If we're going to assume away 4% and 9% light tech and state credits, gap lending programs that cities put together with cash, with CDBG and home funds, with those public finance mechanisms I mentioned, all work well for very small projects. Operating subsidy programs, there's really no minimum size to a project-based Section 8 allocation, right? And so you can have Section 8 on very, very small projects. It's on a unit by unit basis. Public land is another one. If you've got a piece of land, that is a great way to incentivize someone to come build something on it. If you can get it to them for free,
Right.
or low costs.
Right. So there is, thank you again, Adam, for your presentation and for covering the different ways that housing can be funded. So I want to encourage the participants in this breakout session to please apply fill out the form and request funding. I've also put the link to the post-event survey. Please fill it out, and we'll send the link also in email, post-event email, and we will be posting this recording to the webpage as well. So please join me in thanking Adam and also Robert. We appreciate your expertise, and we look forward to more once we receive requests. And we'll be in touch after September when we've had a chance to evaluate the requests that we receive for the free technical assistance. Adam, Robert, any final words?
I don't have any. No, thank you, Adam.
Well, thank you very much, Adam, and thank you all. Please do fill out the post-event survey, and we look forward to being in touch with all of you.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Bye.
Thank you.